Earlier this summer, we set out to make a drum smoker from a steel 55-gallon drum. We found a posting on Craigslist selling food-grade 55-gallon drums for a fair price and bought 2 of them. We brought them back to the garage, and in between working on other projects, we started this build. We bought the barrels from a bee farmer who had used them to hold honey. They're food-grade barrels, which means they have a special food-safe interior epoxy coating, and it pretty much guarantees that there's no weird toxins or contaminants in the barrels. Some people choose to leave all the paint intact and use them as is, especially since you wouldn't normally be getting a smoker hot enough to burn off all that paint. But in the interest of giving ourselves a little peace of mind, and to keep the option open of using it as a grill in the future, we chose to remove the interior epoxy. It seemed to be a fairly tough coating, and it would take a fair amount of sanding to remove it manually. So we decided to try something we had read about online and burn the barrels out. Basically, we'll start a really hot fire and try to burn off all the paint we can. Hey, once it actually starts burning the paint, don't breathe that.
Wow, that's okay to breathe, it's food grade.
Maybe move the propane torch and the wheelbarrow.
How do we have to have this discussion when we have fires?
Once the fire got going, immediately the paint on the outside of the barrels was coming off. Pretty soon, the glossy finish was gone from the barrel. It's worth noting that we did this outside on a day with a bit of a breeze and tried to inhale as little as possible near the burning barrel. After burning the barrel for a while, it became clear that the coating on the inside of the barrel was going to need more heat to evenly burn it off. So what we decided to do was cut a hole in the bottom of the barrel and add some more air. The hole saw didn't work out, partially because it was made for wood, and partially because the heat from inside the barrel was just too much and basically melted the teeth off on the ends of it. So we switched to the angle grinder, which was easily able to cut a small hole in the base of the barrel. And now that we have an access port at the base of the fire, we can take this miniature shop vacuum and blow air straight into the barrel.
Nice and toasty.
This worked great to significantly increase the intensity and temperature of the fire. Although the temperature at the base of the barrel got so intense, we had to get a little creative in order to keep everything from melting. With the addition of the shop vac, the paint on the outside of the barrel was pretty much burned off, and it seemed like at least some of the epoxy on the inside was burning off as well. We kept it burning for maybe an hour with intermittent use of the shop vac. Once it was getting dark, and we were pretty convinced it was as burned as it was going to get, we put the top on the barrel to eventually put out the fire and also to let everything heat soak. The next morning, we pulled the top off and examined the results. Well, we definitely made a hell of a mess, that's for sure. A lot of the epoxy was burned off, and in some spots you could just rub it off by hand, but there's also a lot of surface rust from sealing the moisture of the fire in the barrel overnight. And at some parts the epoxy coating is almost untouched. So it was worth a try, and we made some charcoal out of it, but it wasn't enough to remove all of the interior coating. At least the exterior paint was pretty much gone, as was some of the grass underneath that fire. So, really the only option left was to grind off everything on the inside. This was dirty and time-consuming and very loud, but it did eventually get the job done. Did I mention it was dirty? And after all that grinding, the barrel sure isn't pretty, but at least it's fairly clean, and it's a good enough starting point for our smoker. For the kind of smoker we're looking to make, we need the drum to be horizontal, and we're going to cut a large door out of the side. This definitely isn't the easiest way to make a smoker out of one of these drums, but we were looking for capacity. Sean was looking to cook at least 40 pounds of meat at a time. We made guiding lines with masking tape and used the angle grinder to cut out the door. Due to the width of the blade on the angle grinder, doing things this way means that there's going to be a bit of a gap around the door. That's pretty much unavoidable. We had plans to put a lip on the bottom of the door to keep things sturdy and slide the whole thing up so that there would only be little bits of gap at the sides of the door. With that panel removed, we cut a piece of 1/8 inch steel to serve as a bottom lip for the door opening. We cleaned up the edge of the cut as best we could to make the best fit with the lip. Then, using magnets to hold it together, we tack welded on the steel strap for the lower lip. Because the skin of the barrel is only made of 20 gauge steel and it's fairly thin, it made the welding a bit tricky since this welder does not do so well with thin steel. It welds well enough to get a secure attachment, but things aren't exactly airtight. We had plans to come back and seal the outsides of these seams later on, but for time reasons, it just didn't happen. In order to actually attach the lid, we were going to make our own hinges out of all thread and steel tubing. We tack welded a second piece of steel strap to the first one to hold them in place, while the top one was welded to the door for the smoker. Once all the hinge pieces were cut out, we used the vise to bend the all thread and make the hinges for the door. With those pieces held in place on the barrel, everything was welded on. Making the hinges like this give everything a little bit of leeway so things can fit together well, but also creates a secure yet simple hinge mechanism for the door. With the hinges securely welded in place, you can see the door placement at top has a bit of overlap, so it should seal at least fairly well. The welds at the bottom are spotty, but again, we wanted to go back later and add some sealer. We cut off the tack welds holding the two pieces of strap steel together, and at last, we had an opening door. For the handle, we took this piece of steel rod and bent it into a U-shape. It was pretty sturdy, so it took some doing. We used the hitch pin hole on the Blazer to bend the steel rod. Heating it up would have made it a lot easier, but where's the fun in that?
That's pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, that's not bad. Not bad.
We then cut our handle to the desired length and welded it onto the door. The door works, but it kind of hangs up upon closing. A little bit of creative sanding helped the door close much more easily. We went through a lot of different design ideas, but what we ended up deciding on was using the top third of the second barrel as the smoke box for the smoker. We didn't burn this one out because it just kinda didn't seem worth it. It definitely took more effort to remove the epoxy coating without the fire, but a flap disc did eventually get the job done. Then, once again, we marked the cut with masking tape and cut just below the topmost reinforcing rib of the barrel. After deburring the edges and a little more grinding, this part of the barrel was cleaned out and ready to go. We cut notches in the piece of barrel that's going to be used for the smoke box to get it to fit up nice and tight against the main barrel. With that fit into place, we started tack welding it together. In order to get it to fit as well as possible against the slightly warped bottom of the barrel, we would tack weld where the steel was touching and use a hammer to persuade the rest to fill in the gaps. After a few rounds of this, we had a fairly tight fit and a well-secured smoke box. The next step was to fill in the overhang area, and to do this, we cut a cardboard template to fit, and then used the jigsaw to cut that out of 16 gauge steel. 16 gauge seemed to be the thickness of the top and bottom of the barrel, so it seemed like a good fit to make everything nice and secure. Cutting out that piece of sheet steel got a little hairy at times, but eventually the jigsaw got the job done. Then we matched up that filler panel to the bottom of the smoke box and welded everything together. With that big step done, we needed to make legs to hold the whole smoker up. We cut apart these pieces of old angled steel from a bed frame to make the legs. The angle grinder was used to remove the rivets and the old bed hardware, so we were left with plain pieces of angle iron. And from this stack of materials, we measured how long we wanted the legs to be and cut out the pieces we were going to use. We also used this opportunity to weld a small piece of plate over the hole we cut to use the shop vac when we were burning out the barrel. We then held the legs against the barrel and the smoke box and welded them to both for a nice, secure hold. After some measuring and even more eyeballing, we got all 4 legs welded to the smoker, and we were finally able to see what it was going to look like. The next step was to cut more sections of bed frame and box in those wobbly legs. After all that cutting and all that welding, the whole thing is starting to feel very solid. The next step was to cut the hole to connect the smoke box to the main body of the smoker. With that done, next we needed to cap off both ends of the smoker. We took both of the steel lids, removed the seals, and ground off all the paint. Then, to make a quick and dirty chimney that's definitely too short and probably will need some work later on, we took a piece of sheet aluminum that actually came with the Datsun and bent it around a 2x4 to make a nice square exhaust chimney. We then used aluminum rivets to hold the shape together and cut tabs out of the bottom so we would be able to rivet the aluminum to the steel barrel lid. Once everything was cleaned up a bit, we marked out and cut a hole in the lid for the chimney to fit up to. With a bit more drilling and a few more rivets, everything was securely held together. And there's our funny looking stubby little chimney for the smoker. Just to be sure the whole thing wasn't going to flex once we heated it up and put 50 pounds of meat in it, we added an extra little brace to connect 2 of the legs to the side of the barrel. The addition of this little brace made a big difference to how solid the whole thing feels. The next step was to cut another hole in our other lid for the intake. In order to make a very basic adjustable intake for the smoke box, we used a scrap piece of sheet metal and some leftover steel rod to make a sliding door to allow us to adjust the amount of air going into the smoker. Next up, we cut out this rectangular piece of steel to serve as a diverter between the smoke box and the main chamber of the smoker. This should keep the heat level more consistent throughout. We got a few pieces of perforated steel grate from the hardware store and used it to make grates to hold up the meat inside of the smoker. It was a bit fiddly figuring out exactly how to support all of these grates while keeping everything accessible, but eventually we sorted it out and we used some strap steel going from one side of the barrel to the other to support the grates. The top piece is supported by a small piece of angle iron and a wide piece of steel strap. At the opening of the barrel, the grate is simply held up by 2 tabs in order to keep everything open and accessible. We cut out a few more pieces of this perforated steel in order to make an inner cage inside of the smoke box to hold the coals. This will make it possible to remove the side of the barrel for cleaning and adding more coals. It also keeps the coals lifted off the bottom of the barrel to let air flow through them for more effective heating. Once this was all welded in, the smoker is as done as it's going to be in order to start cooking all of this meat for our 4th of July party the next day. So we dragged the smoker outside and got ready for the first burn. We used vegetable oil in a Windex bottle to coat the inside of the smoker in order to season the steel to hopefully prevent it from rusting and to build up a solid layer of carbon on the inside. Then we used charcoal and wood to light an intense fire in both the smoke box and the main chamber. The hope is that that smoke will coat the inside of the smoker and all that heat will burn off any remaining contaminants. After burning for a while, we emptied it out and loaded it up with baked beans, brisket, ribs, chicken, and pork, loaded the smoke box up with charcoal, and started cooking. It required a lot of attention, partially due to the incredible winds that night, which required a last-minute modification to install this wind deflector to the chimney. It's also not terribly efficient because it doesn't seal very well, but we're hoping we can work that out for next time. But really, all that's okay, because we were able to take 2 55-gallon honey drums and turn them into this awesome, large backyard smoker that we made with our own hands. Nope, we don't.
Never do what we do.
Nope. It's how did.
Yeah.
It's not how to, it's how did.
How it was made. Not how to make it.
No, how it shouldn't be made.
Yes.
But was anyway.
Ready?
And this mess we were making was finally starting to look like something. Kind of like a weird, hunched over pig, maybe.